sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, this is a very special episode of Mansplaining.
Indeed.
We have reached a major milestone in the history of this podcast, our 100th episode.
Hard to believe.
How about that?
It is literally hard to believe. Like, I look back on it and it seems like we've been doing this for a while, but still, 100 episodes.
Yeah. It's not quite 4.5 years, but we've been at this pretty steadily every 2 to 3 weeks for more than 4 years. And it's quite an accomplishment, I think. Mm-hmm. And to that end, we've got some testimonials to play for our listeners from some friends of the podcast.
Exciting.
And yeah, I think you'll be excited to hear this. So roll tape.
This is Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I will terminate you if you don't listen to Mansplaining's 100th episode. I'll be back, and so will Joe and Mark to pump you up.
This is Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day to listen to the 100th episode of Mansplaining. Listening is where love begins, listening to ourselves, then to our neighbors, but most of all, listening to Mansplaining.
Hi, this is Marilyn Monroe. As I used to say, we are all of us stars, and we deserve to twinkle. And you know who twinkles the brightest of them all? Joe and Mark.
Spock here. While it's true that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one, I still need you to listen to Mansplaining. It's the logical thing to do.
I'm Jack Kennedy, and I just had to come back from the dead to tell you that Mansplaining is releasing its 100th episode. And yes, there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll.
Well, Mark, we have friends in high places, don't we?
Afterlife high, yeah.
Yes, including a dead president taking some precious time from his eternal rest to say some kind words about the podcast. I'm flattered and honored.
I know. Yes, it's a special time when someone speaks from beyond the veil to share his appreciation of your podcast. So thank you, JFK.
Okay, on to the present. We have what I would characterize as a strange two-part episode. And this is part 2 of that episode. Last time you asked me why big companies like Google run out of ideas. And we considered that question through the prism of this guy, Clayton Christensen, in a book he wrote about disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation. And then at the end of that episode, I kind of turned around the question to you. It's a vastly different subject area, but the same question, which is why I consider this kind of an odd pairing of a two-part episode. So my question to you is, why are so many of our favorite rock and pop artists, why do they run out of ideas? Mm-hmm. And I asked you to consider it, attacking the question any way you like, but reminded you of the prism that Clayton Christensen put on this in the context of companies and see whether there's any connection there. So I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about this subject, because this is something I've thought about for a long time, and I'm probably going to have a lot to say about it. So what did you find?
Well, as always, thank you for the question. And thank you retroactively for not asking me about politics, because diving into this question was one of the refuges available to me over the last few days.
Oh, yeah, we certainly need it.
Yeah. Anyway, we can get back to politics later, and I'm sure we will in future episodes, but we're here today to talk about music. And it is a really interesting question that so many great pop and rock artists seem to have peaked at such a young age. And I will be dipping back into the topic of Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma for insight on the question.
Oh, good.
It's not a perfect match, but it definitely provides food for thought. But more on that later. If you believe in the idea that pop and rock musicians peak at an early age and seemingly run out of ideas later in their career, for support you need look no further than the Rolling Stone list of the top 500 songs of all time. If you look at the top 10 songs on that list, the average age of the artists when those songs were released is 26 years, 11 months old.
Mm-hmm.
The oldest performer in the top 10 was Marvin Gaye, who was just short of 32 when What's Going On was released in 1971, while the youngest, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, were both 21 years old when Satisfaction was released in 1965.
Mm. My favorite band of all time is the Beatles.
Of course.
And the Beatles are a beautiful case in point for this theory about artists running out of ideas.
Yes.
All of the Beatles' recorded work was completed before any of them turned 30 years old.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's kind of just a stunning fact in and of itself. And then I think about particularly important, innovative Beatles songs. I think of a song like Eleanor Rigby, written by Paul McCartney when he was 23 years old. Only 2 to 3 years after I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, Yeah, 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 he writes a song like Eleanor Rigby.
Mm-hmm.
Arranged for a string octet with lyrics about loneliness. I don't think Paul McCartney has written anything as good as that song in the last 40 plus years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we will be coming back to McCartney and the Beatles later. They're definitely part of this story. And the idea that pop and rock musicians peak early might just make sense. There's sort of a balancing act when it comes to creating art that others will find meaningful. On the one hand, youth is an asset when you're trying to make it as a musician. When you're young, it's relatively easy to give your entire focus to music. You probably don't have kids yet, and you have few responsibilities or distractions that would take you away from practicing and performing. But by the same token, you can't be so young that you have no life experience at all to draw on when creating your art. And you also need to have enough experience as a musician that when you do create, what you do is top-notch. There's a notion that Malcolm Gladwell popularized in his book Outliers, that typically it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to acquire expertise in an area of study. One of the examples that Gladwell offered, as a matter of fact, was the period between 60 and 62 when the Beatles performed gigs in Hamburg, Germany, and logged so many hours on stage that they became much better musicians than they were previously. So there might just be a sweet spot, when you're still young enough that you can give your whole self to your music, but experienced enough that you're ready to create at the highest level.
Mm.
But then the realities of a music career might intervene to cut that creative peak short. For one thing, a music career can be a tough gig. There's a relentless cycle of touring, promotion, and then going back into the studio to record more hits for the next round of touring and promotion. For artists who achieve early fame, the pressure to maintain that level of success can be immense, which can easily lend itself to alcoholism, drug abuse, or other signs of burnout that make it difficult to sustain peak creativity. Some studies, meanwhile, have suggested that younger people are more cognitively flexible than older adults, which could allow them to be more innovative and creative in what they produce. Younger, less established artists are also less risk-averse because they have less to lose. One of the most significant challenges faced by artists who achieve early success is something called the legacy trap. When an artist releases a groundbreaking album or song that resonates deeply with listeners, they create a set of expectations that audiences are reluctant to see broken.
Oh, yeah.
The audience often expects or even demands a continuation of that same artistic style, and musicians are pressured to replicate their early success both by fans and by the music industry, which seeks to capitalize on familiar and proven sounds.
Right. So in the studio, you have to basically record songs that sound the same as the ones you just did. And then when you're out live, you have to play the hits to your audience, which kind of gets you in a rut of doing the same thing over and over again.
Right, yes. And it's exactly that pressure to play the hits that can lead artists to feel creatively stifled. Even if they wish to experiment with new styles, genres, or lyrical themes, they are constrained by the expectations of their established audience. For example, Bob Dylan's controversial move from acoustic to electric guitar in 1965 eventually received critical praise, But in the moment, it was met with intense backlash from his folk fans who felt he was abandoning the essence of what made him popular in the first place.
Yes.
He was nearly booed off the stage.
Yes.
The legacy trap made it difficult for him to innovate without alienating a portion of his fan base. Psychologically, this trap can weigh heavily on artists. Musicians who once thrived on the freedom of creative exploration may find themselves increasingly risk-averse, reluctant to try new approaches that could disappoint fans or fail commercially. Legacy tours, greatest hits albums, and anniversary reissues are financially safer bets for both the artists and the labels. And this is where the innovator's dilemma starts to seem like a real parallel.
Yes, I was just thinking that.
Established artists, like established companies, have something to lose, and that might make them less willing to disrupt themselves. They're serving an audience. They're equivalent of the existing customers served by established businesses, and that audience wants them to play their favorite songs, not something radical and new.
Right.
Ultimately, for pop and rock musicians, the legacy trap is a double-edged sword. It provides them with a loyal fan base and steady income, but it can also limit their ability to reinvent themselves and grow artistically.
Yes, and to use Clayton Christensen's words, the audience wants them to sustain the innovation they came up with instead of continuing to be disruptive innovators. They become sustaining innovators.
Exactly. Now, an interesting parallel to rock and pop musicians can be found in the field of mathematics, where it's commonly said that peak achievement comes early in life. Many mathematicians, such as Évariste Galois, Srinivasa Ramanujan, and Niels Henrik Abel, also made their most significant contributions while young, driven by a combination of skill and freedom from conventional thought. In fact, it's so commonly accepted that advanced mathematics is a young person's game that the Fields Medal, which is commonly described as the Nobel Prize for Mathematics, is given only to mathematicians below the age of 40. In both music and mathematics, neuroplasticity might play a significant role. Neuroplasticity, which enables the brain to adapt and reorganize, is present throughout a person's life, but is at its peak early in life. By midlife, many people may find it harder to break habitual thought patterns or explore entirely new paradigms, which can affect creative output. Studies have shown that creativity does not wane as we age. Some people cite biology as a reason why you're more creative when you're younger than older, but actual studies do not support that. Many novelists, for instance, peak later in life because writing benefits from life experience and a capacity for introspection. And in painting, artists like Picasso or Jackson Pollock had varied creative peaks across their lifespan, and theorists of innovation identify two types of creativity, and both shed light on this subject. On the one hand, there's conceptual innovation. Conceptual innovation is when you challenge existing ideas and bring a new perspective to established practices. Conceptual innovation is all about new ideas that challenge and overturn the status quo. For conceptual innovators in the music world, think of artists who make their mark by bringing a fresh sound, a novel way of writing a song, or an intense energy that is markedly different from the previous generation of performers. Acts like the Beatles, Prince, and Nirvana introduced something the world hadn't heard before, and their early success hinged on those groundbreaking qualities. Conceptual innovation often aligns with youth, when people are more likely to experiment and rebel against established norms. But in addition to conceptual innovation, there's also experimental innovation, which is the process of systematically testing and refining existing ideas. In this type of innovation, you treat your creative product as a work in progress, trying new things, learning lessons, and applying those lessons to the next round of creation.
Like trial and error.
Exactly. Experimental innovation within music is the domain of older artists, who have a wealth of experience to draw on when refining their musical creations. I mentioned neuroplasticity before and how it's highest during youth, but other mental factors like complex reasoning and emotional intelligence grow with age, which can mean that while younger artists are more likely to create disruptive work, older artists can focus on greater refinement and depth in their music. It's relatively easy to find examples of experimental innovation within jazz, where artists tend to peak in their 30s or 40s when they've mastered their technique, and also in classical music, where it's commonplace for older composers to release important compositions later in life. Beethoven, for instance, famously continued to compose even after his hearing failed, right up until his death at the age of 56. And some pop and rock recording artists, such as David Bowie or Johnny Cash, managed to reinvent themselves as they grew older. Instead of trying to replicate the conceptual breakthroughs of their youth, they focused on refining their craft, exploring new genres, or collaborating with other musicians to evolve their sound. Other examples of this would be Leonard Cohen, Nick Cave, and Kate Bush, who released critically acclaimed work later in their careers. But I'd say the best example of this is Taylor Swift. She enjoyed early success. She signed her first recording contract at the tender age of 14, which blows my mind.
Yeah.
And she wrote some memorable songs in her early 20s. She never stopped creating, however, and now in her mid-30s, she's at the peak of her career and arguably the biggest recording star since Michael Jackson. It is, however, undeniable that there are fewer examples of experimental innovation to be found in pop and rock music than in other genres. So why is that? I feel like the answer might be found in the music industry itself, namely its preference to market and promote younger acts. Pop and rock music has traditionally been youth-oriented. It often plays with the themes of rebellion, discovery, first love, and angst, all of which resonate deeply with younger audiences. For an artist in their 20s, their lived experience aligns perfectly with that audience. As artists age, however, their own interests, experiences, and perspectives naturally evolve. Their new concerns, starting a family, dealing with relationships that have settled into routine, or coming to terms with their first signs of gray in their hair. You can certainly write a good song about those things, but they don't align with the experiences or concerns of that younger audience. Teens and young adults on average listen to the most music, and so the music industry's marketing muscle is focused on this younger demographic. And that can make it difficult for older artists to stay in the spotlight, particularly as different styles of music, such as rock, punk, new wave, and rap, come into vogue and make older musicians seem behind the times. All this can serve to reinforce the idea that pop and rock musicians peak early.
With minds like steel traps, walking door here to the sun. The interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain. It's appalling that you don't do it too.
Ultimately, I'd say the story isn't as simple as musicians peak early and then run out of ideas. The trajectory of an artist's career depends on a host of factors: personal circumstances, artistic goals, their willingness to take risks, and even luck. Some artists can't handle the rigors of touring and performing, and so they drop out voluntarily. Sometimes a brilliant career is cut short by substance abuse or suicide, as is the case of Kurt Cobain. Sometimes a brilliant partnership, like that between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, comes to an end when the group breaks up. And while it's true that many artists do seem to experience an early peak driven by conceptual innovation, others find ways to reinvent themselves and stay relevant. The music industry, though, with its obsession with youth and newness, doesn't always make space for that kind of growth or give it the spotlight that it might deserve. I went into this research with a blank canvas. I really had never considered the question before. And I came out of it thinking that, while it's true that pop and rock musicians' early efforts do tend to be celebrated more highly than later efforts, the reasons for that are many, ranging from biological factors like neuroplasticity to the simple mechanics of music industry marketing. And I'm left wondering what amazing songs and albums we might have to enjoy if more pop and rock musicians were afforded the opportunity to enjoy long careers that encompassed later and more reflective creative periods. But you're a much bigger music fan than I am. What do you think? Do you think the factors I laid out here are compelling, or is there something that I underemphasized or left out?
Boy, I'm not sure what I think. When you were speaking about Taylor Swift, and I am not qualified to analyze her musical trajectory, but there's no question that she's the most popular recording artist in the world right now, with the possible exception only of Beyonce. Mm-hmm. But the question that I think of when I consider Taylor Swift is whether her current work, as well received as it is and as popular as it is it as seminal, or as innovative as her earlier work? That's the question that I would like somebody to answer, because I can't answer it for her, but I can answer that question for John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
Sure.
And unquestionably, their earlier work was more innovative, more groundbreaking than their later work. So I guess I would caution you, in the case of a Taylor Swift or Paul McCartney megastar, to just rely on the fact that they're very popular and sell gazillions of records. That's not necessarily a good evaluator of the quality of their work. It could simply be because there's popularity has its own rewards,
Yeah. Well, I think I have 2 points in response to that. And the first is that Lennon and McCartney are possibly a special case in that their best work seems to have been in partnership. And I do feel like we underemphasize creative partnerships like that when we think about creative work. I think partnership has had a role to play in landmark works to a greater extent than we allow for. And so, yes, I would agree with you that neither Lennon nor McCartney got back to the level of the Beatles later on, but they weren't working together anymore. For a long period of time, they weren't even talking to each other.
Yeah.
And I think it's a possibility that for those two, their best work was when they had the other one to, as I've heard it described, McCartney had these great pop sensibilities and Lennon was the more serious artist. And so Lennon could make McCartney more serious and McCartney could make Lennon more approachable. And the two together were better than either apart.
Yeah.
And then the second point is it's a lot easier to say this is an artist's best work, but it's very difficult to know that you make that judgment correctly, because what counts as best with Taylor Swift? A lot of people will say the best song that she ever wrote is All Too Well, which came out when she was 22. But she's still writing songs today. The consensus is that's the song that was the best one. And so does that prove that she's run out of ideas? Because if she's out of ideas, she's sure writing a whole lot of songs.
Right.
Or is it just that we tend to think that a artist's best period is when they're young and fresh and we've never heard that before? And so someone like Taylor Swift, who's been popular for going on 20 years now, we tend to discount the later efforts. I wonder if back in the days of Mozart and Beethoven, everyone was like, oh yeah, Mozart, he was great in his early 20s, but his later stuff, it doesn't stand up. But, 200 years later, we think of it all as quality and we don't bring that preconception to it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point you make. A very fair point. I think what a rock critic might say is there are some special artists out there who are restless, who reinvent themselves, who are not satisfied to rely on their past laurels, and they're endlessly creative,
Right.
I feel like the Beatles were that artist in the 60s, as I mentioned at the beginning, to go from She Loves You to, Hey Jude and Eleanor Rigby, right? It's just an incredible accomplishment.
Yeah.
But there are other artists. You mentioned Bob Dylan going electric and then going gospel, Sting, starting with basically a punk new wave band, The Police, and involving himself in jazz and other pop forms. Elvis Costello, endlessly recreating himself and remaining popular. I guess that's the magic formula, right? If you can reinvent yourself and keep your audience and bring your audience along with you, that's a special sauce that not a lot of artists have. And maybe that's the exception to the rule we're establishing in this episode.
Yeah. I think it's very hard to do that, which is why only figures as big as David Bowie and Bob Dylan and others of that tier are able to do it. There's a point where the audience is going to start diminishing if you're writing about your experience as a 40-year-old man. If you and the record label are still thinking that you need to fill an arena with 20-year-olds because that music doesn't really speak to them
Right.
anymore, and 40-year-olds don't tend to buy concert tickets.
Right.
And so it takes a special collection of ingredients to sustain a music career beyond the point where they pass outside the window of being youth-oriented. And only a few are able to make the transition. And I really feel like that's a shame. I would have loved to hear the record that Lennon and McCartney would have collaborated on in their 40s. That would have been fascinating to me. But we never got to hear it because they broke up before they got to 30 and they couldn't get into the studio again after that.
Yeah. Okay, there are two other things I want to talk about based on what you said. One is the Clayton Christensen idea about disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation. We talked about how some established artists play the hits in concert to appease their existing fans. The Rolling Stones are the best example of that, right?
Yeah.
And is
the
that
Eagles too? Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And people say they sold out or they're complacent, but isn't that an example of sustaining innovation? Right? I feel it is. And also the artists and bands for whose songs all sound the same. You know, I was scratching my head trying to think of a good example, and I think I came up with one, but it's certainly going to date me. KC and the Sunshine Band, right? Their hit songs, Get Down Tonight, Shake Your Booty, I'm Your Boogeyman. They're all basically the same song, rewritten with different lyrics, you know? And is that not an example of sustaining innovation? What do you think?
Oh, yeah. They're in exactly the same position as the established company that wants to serve its customers. And so if you're thinking of how is a band like the Eagles sustaining innovation when they're performing in their 60s or 70s or however old they are now, and I imagine they're thinking of it in terms of how could we provide a better concert experience for the people who are coming out for us? So they're not innovating in the recording studio, but maybe they can still innovate on stage in terms of how they connect with the audience. And it is to sustain that connection.
Yeah, I think Christensen meant sustaining innovation as tweaking the product, right? To keep the sales high and to keep people interested. And that's basically what the Eagles did with all their late career albums. They kept the formula, they tweaked it a little, but basically they did the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly so.
Okay. And then one other thing, you know the concept of Occam's razor?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So for people who aren't familiar with that, it's basically the simplest explanation is usually the best explanation, a kind of wise concept to live by. And you mentioned something at the beginning that I want to get back to. What seems like a blissfully simple explanation of this entire phenomenon that you mentioned earlier, that is just the time of life when these artists are recording, you know? I read one psychologist who wrote that the two great periods of creativity in a person's life happen before 30 and after 60. Why is that? It's because before you're 30, you're not married, you don't have kids. And after you're 60, your kids have left the nest and you're not so hyper-focused on your career and making money anymore. In other words, in those two periods of life, there's a lack of distractions, the lack of the consuming distractions that enables a person to be creative. And so applied to the lens of pop music, you mentioned at the beginning how these people were recording these hits at age 23 and they're at that time of life prior to 30. I wonder if that's simply the answer right there. I guess the question for you is it simply that and not all those other things we mentioned? Or is it all of the above?
Well, as part of my research for this was I got my hair cut, and the hairstylist who cuts my hair plays in a band. And so I asked her before I wrote down anything else what she thought the answer to this question was. And the first thing that she mentioned is when you're a kid, maybe you're living with your parents, you don't have a job, all you need to do is play your guitar and play with your band. And so it's the best time to record. So I do think that that's definitely part of it. I don't think that's the only part of it. I think it is a tangled mess of factors, some of which will be stronger in this person's life versus that person's life. I mentioned in passing drug abuse. That has certainly cut short a number of musical careers, but it's not a factor in everybody's career. So it only pops up within certain biographies. And like you say, having kids, there are some musicians who never do have kids. So it's never a point at which kids are a distraction for them. But for other musicians, yes, that would be a huge distraction. So I think that there's a number of factors that can come into play. And for any individual, there's probably a fingerprint that's somewhat unique to them, but that it pulls on themes that show up within multiple scenarios. And so I do tend to believe that it is a mix of both biology and culture and capitalism that's really creating this phenomenon.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think you got it there. Well, thank you for answering that question. That was an interesting conversation and something I think about way too much, probably. But it'll give me another excuse to ponder it in my private life. So thanks.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed answering it. You ready for the next question?
I am, yes.
So, Joe, I was reading the other day that Spirit Airlines is poised on the edge of bankruptcy. And I don't know if you're familiar with Spirit. They're an airline that is famous for extremely low fares and also for assessing fees for absolutely everything.
You got to wonder how low the fares really are if they're charging you for every nitpicky thing, right?
Right. And this really posed a question for me because you and I are old enough to remember when airline travel included certain extras, like you got a meal on board
Yes.
and there were multiple beverages, and it was a fairly enjoyable experience. And then airlines like Spirit and Southwest came around and cut everything back to the bone, and the industry has gone in that direction where the fares might seem low, but then you pay for everything. Like the first bag is $40 and
Right.
that sort of thing.
Right.
But now Spirit, which is the flagship for that approach, is on the edge of bankruptcy. So my question is, if the old way of providing a comfortable flight was not financially viable, and the new way of providing a bare bones experience is not financially viable, what in fact is the future of airline travel?
Interesting. You know, while you were asking me this question, I was thinking of another infamous discount carrier that you probably remember as well, People Express. Remember them?
Yes, I do.
Another one that ultimately couldn't make it, right? Okay, well, that's an interesting question. I look forward to thinking about it. And I have a feeling that there's a long history of discount carriers going under, using the People Express as my example. So that might be part of the answer. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it for today's episode. We will come back in a couple of weeks with my answer to the question Mark just posed to me. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
I used to fill arenas, now it's coffee shops. Trading platinum records for a crowd that claps and then stops. My songs were the soundtrack to your reckless Friday nights. Now your playlist skips me for someone wearing neon tights. I'm not bitter, I swear, just a little bemused how the kids call me a legend, like I'm yesterday's news. Once the voice of your youth, now I'm background noise to your carpool commutes and your all grown-up toys. I still write about love, but it's a different scene. Less about fireworks and more the spaces in between. No late night confessions or whiskey-soaked regrets. Just a mortgage, a dog, and some existential dread. I'm not bitter, I swear, just a little bemused how the kids call me a legend, like I'm yesterday's news. Once the voice of your youth, now I'm background noise to your carpool commutes and your all grown-up toys. They say nostalgia sells, but no one tells you when. Your golden years get labeled, remember back then. So I'll sing for the ones who still hum my old tracks while they're sorting the laundry or filing their tax. So here's to the echoes, the faded applause, the life in the margins, the love without cause. I'm still here, still dreaming, still finding my way through the echoes of yesterday and the truths of today.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.